Hello and welcome to Top Story. In China, Western sympathy for Tibet is provoking a storm of indignation and anti-Western protests, and France has been first in the firing line. Angry protesters have been gathering outside the Chinese branches of the French supermarket chain Carrefour to protest at the treatment of the Olympic flame by pro-Tibetan supporters in Paris. Chinese television has whipped up anti-French feeling by showing video of protesters trying to snatch the flame from the hands of a handicapped Chinese athlete. And there's resentment that President Nicolas Sarkozy says he might not attend the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics if China doesn't open a dialogue with the Dalai Lama on Tibet. More generally, there is fury at what people believe has been one-sided Western reporting of events in Tibet. So concerned is the French government that it's sending a high-ranking diplomatic mission to China to calm nerves. But it's not just the West that has cause for concern. With the Olympics just months away, can the Chinese authorities afford to let the anti-Western mood get out of control? Well, joining me now to discuss the situation is Jean-Philippe Béja, who's a specialist on China at the National Centre for Scientific Research here in Paris. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. France is clearly paying the price for those demonstrations, and in particular, I suppose, for the protest by the members of the French National Assembly.
Well, for this, and I think also because there has been some kind of a disappointment in the minds of the Chinese leadership, because France has always been the closest friend of China in Europe and in the West. And this time it seems that after Sarkozy went to China and secured very good contracts with China, they believe that his change of mind is really absolutely scandalous.
And now we have the mayor of Paris offering honorary citizenship to the Dalai Lama. That's not going to go down very well, is it?
No, not at all, of course. But what we should see is that there are two lines in France, and there has always been. The line of Chirac, which is to accommodate the Chinese leadership that Sarkozy inherited, and the 1989 Mitterrand line that many people have forgotten. But when France opened its doors to the leaders of the pro-democracy Tiananmen movement, we could say that Bertrand Delanoë is inheriting Mitterrand's 90 line, and that until now Sarkozy had been inheriting Chirac's line. So that's why the Chinese were shocked, because they thought that it was a really very deep change of mind.
And now the French are facing the same dilemma that the Germans faced last year about how to deal with this issue. On the one hand, you've got the temptation of enormous contracts with the Chinese, and the other question of human rights.
Well, you know, one of the problems with Western leaders is that they don't have the consistency that you need to deal with a country like China. If you have a very straight line, if you stick to your line, which is a line of friendship, as described by Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia, for example, which means you have a straight and frank dialogue with the Chinese authorities. You don't run over your principles in order to secure contracts, and you will secure both the contracts and a good an equal footing dialogue.
The Chinese have a point as well. It's a sporting event that's being celebrated this year. The time to protest against the Chinese is when the whole issue of whether China should be awarded the Olympic Games.
Well, of course, but it's not that simple. You know, China has actually used the Olympics to make its comeback on the international scene. So, from a certain point of view, you can say that actually China did start to politicize the games. The thing is, what happened in Tibet and the demonstrations it triggered was absolutely not forecast by the Chinese leaders, and so now they don't know exactly how to handle this change of mind of public opinion. It's very difficult for them to imagine that there is an autonomous public opinion in the Western countries which is separated from the leadership. So they think that the government organized these protests, which is not the case.
But, I mean, seen from the perspective of the television viewer in China, it must have looked horrific, particularly the demonstrations in Paris with somebody trying to snatch the flame from the paraplegic athlete.
Well, of course, and this shows the dilemma in which the Chinese leadership is. On the one hand, as it was a failure on the international scene, they tried to revamp their legitimacy in the domestic scene by showing that there had been a concerted anti-Chinese effort. This has whipped up a kind of nationalism which now threatens to go out of hand. And on last Sunday, the People's Daily had an editorial saying we have to change our indignation into strength in order to build a strong China, because the Chinese leaders are afraid that if demonstrations go out of hand, it would be very bad for China's image.
It happened in the recent past, 2005 against the Japanese.
2005 against the Japanese, 1999 against NATO, and every time the scenario was the same. You have 3 or 4 days of demonstration. It even went as far as breaking the glasses of the American consulate or Japanese embassy, and then after a few days, the leadership comes out and says, okay, now let's go back home, and there are lots of ways to show patriotism, and one of them is to build a country.
To what extent can you talk about spontaneity with these demonstrations?
Well, you know, both things are. There is a very strong discourse of humiliation of China by the Western countries since the Opium War in education. So the patriotism and nationalism can be very easily whipped up in China. And it's also true that during the 19th century, China was victim of Western so-called imperialism. What happens is it is spontaneous, but it is also organized by the country, because the way the media present the situation obviously is very much one-sided. And there is an anti-CNN website in China, but you can't see CNN if you're an ordinary Chinese. So this is the way that Chinese propaganda organs have been whipping up nationalism. But the thing is, it's a double-edged sword, and the Communist Party is afraid of too strong nationalism, because after all, their economic policy is based on globalization, opening up. And so if you have a very strong reaction, you risk to have boycott of Western products, boycott of Western brands, which doesn't go into the Chinese development strategy.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, what about this French diplomatic mission to China? Does that send the right signals, do you think?
I don't think so. You know, what I said is you need to have consistency. You shouldn't be angry at one point and then completely accommodate at another point. I think the best way is to keep a straight line of frank dialogue with the Chinese people, saying that you are for the peaceful rise of China, but that China has to respect some rules. If you have this discourse all the time, it pays in the long term.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we have to end it. Thanks to our guest, Jean-Philippe Béja. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye.